In the sleepy Cornish village of Pereth, a woman's body washes ashore, her death deemed a tragic accident. But when young artist Joyce Lempriere sees a chilling vision of blood on the quay, Miss Jane Marple's sharp instincts awaken as whispers of a hefty insurance policy and a charming husband's debts surface. Miss Marple unravels a web of lies, from a misplaced skiff to a hidden bruise, leading to a shocking confession. Was it a fall or a cold-blooded murder? Dive into a mystery where every clue counts. Chapter 1. The Vision at Pereth Arms. A weathered inn perched on the edge of the Cornish village of Pereth hummed with the gentle clamour of summer. Its low ceilings, blackened by centuries of smoke, and its uneven floors, worn smooth by fishermen's boots, gave it a charm that drew visitors from far beyond the cliffs. In the lounge, where sunlight filtered through mullioned windows, Miss Jane Marple sat in a chintz-covered armchair, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a metronome. Her black lace mittens, faintly out of place in the July warmth, moved with precision, shaping a delicate shawl for a niece back in St. Mary Mead. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, her white hair neatly pinned, her eyes mild behind spectacles. But those who knew her understood that Miss Marple's mind was as sharp as the needles in her hands, catching details others overlooked dot around her. A small group of guests sipped tea and exchanged the idle chatter of holidaymakers. There was Major Palgrave, red-faced and loquacious, recounting tales of his Indian service to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Babcock, a widow with a fondness for bridge and gossip, and Joyce Lempriere, a young artist whose auburn hair and vivid scarves marked her as a bohemian. Joyce, barely 25, had a flair for the dramatic, her stories often teetering on the edge of fantasy. That afternoon, as the tea tray clinked and the scent of scones filled the air, she held court with a tale that silenced even the Major. It was yesterday. Down by the quay, Joyce began, her green eyes wide with conviction. I was sketching. The pavement, those old cobbles, you know, so full of character. The light was perfect, all golden and sharp. But then, as I looked down, I saw it blood, spreading across the stones, thick and dark, pooling right under my feet. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. I blinked, and it was gone. The pavement was clean, not a mark on it, but I swear, it was as real as this teacup. Mrs. Babcock gasped, her hand fluttering to her pearls. Good heavens, my dear, what a frightful thing. You must have been over. Artists, they do work themselves into such states. Major Palgrave snorted. Imagination, that's all. Too much sun, or perhaps a touch of indigestion. I recall, in Bombay, but Miss Marple, her needles pausing for the briefest moment, looked up. How curious, Miss Lempriere, she said, her voice soft and precise. And what time was this, may I ask? Joyce frowned, as if surprised by the question. Oh, about 4 in the afternoon, I think. The quay was quiet, just a few locals about. I packed up soon after. I was so shaken. Miss Marple nodded, her expression placid, but her mind had already begun to turn. Visions, she knew, were often the mind's way of stitching together truths, too subtle for conscious thought. In St. Mary Mead, she had once known a girl who dreamed of a fire that later proved to be arson. Joyce's tale, though fanciful, carried a weight that intrigued her. The conversation drifted to safer topics. The price of fish, the upcoming regatta, but Miss Marple's attention lingered on Joyce, who now sat sketching absently on a napkin. The girl's hands trembled slightly, betraying a nervousness she hadn't voiced. Miss Marple tucked the observation away, her thoughts interrupted by the inn's door swinging open. It was Constable Tregarth, a broad-shouldered man, with a face like weathered granite, who strode in, his helmet tucked under one arm. The room fell silent, sensing news. Tregarth cleared his throat, addressing the innkeeper, but loud enough for all to hear. "There's been an accident, down on the beach. Mrs. Denham found dead this morning, washed up with the tide. Likely slipped from the cliffs, poor soul." A murmur rippled through the lounge. Mrs. Babcock clutched her teacup. Mrs. Denham, that new woman with the handsome husband. Oh, how dreadful. Joyce's pencil snapped in her hand, and Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward her, noting the sudden pallor in her cheeks. "Mrs. Denham," Joyce whispered, almost to herself. "She was at the quay yesterday. I saw her." Miss Marple sat, her knitting in her lap, her gaze steady. "Indeed," she said quietly. "How very interesting." As Tregarth left to make his report, the lounge buzzed with speculation. Major Palgrave opined that cliffs were treacherous. Mrs. Babcock fretted about the dangers of night walks, and Joyce sat silent, her napkin now crumpled in her fist. Miss Marple, however, thought of the blood. Joyce had seen blood that wasn't there, yet perhaps foretold a truth. Death in Pereth, she sensed, was no accident, and the cobbled pavement by the quay might hold secrets yet to be uncovered. Chapter 2. The Widow and the Husband. The morning after the grim discovery on Pereth's beach, the village awoke to a sky heavy with clouds. The sea beyond the cliffs churning with a restless energy that mirrored the unease settling over its inhabitants. The Pereth Arms, usually a haven of cheerful clatter, was subdued, its breakfast room filled with hushed voices and furtive glances. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a corner table with a view of the harbour, sipped her tea and observed the guests with her customary quiet attention. Her black lace mittens rested beside her plate, and her knitting lay folded in a wicker basket at her feet. For even she sensed that the day called for more than idle needlework. The news of Mrs. Carroll Denham's death had spread like wildfire, fanned by the villagers' love of a good story and the visitors' hunger for intrigue. Carroll, a woman of 35 with a reserved manner and a wardrobe that spoke of better days, had been a stranger to Pereth, arriving only 2 months prior with her husband, Geoffrey. The couple had taken a cottage on the edge of the village, a stone's throw from the cliffs, and their presence had sparked mild curiosity but little intimacy. Now, with Carroll's body found tangled in seaweed at the foot of the rocks, that curiosity had turned to fascination and suspicion. Miss Marple, buttering a slice of toast with deliberate care, listened to the conversations around her. Major Palgrave, at a nearby table, was holding forth to a reluctant Mrs. Babcock. Tragic, of course, but these cliffs are deuced dangerous. I warned them myself, saw her walking there one evening, far too close to the edge. No railing, you know. A moment's inattention, and he made a dramatic gesture, nearly upsetting his coffee. Mrs. Babcock, her eyes wide with the thrill of calamity, nodded vigorously. "Oh, Major, it's too awful, and poor Mr. Denham left all alone. I saw him this morning, you know, outside the constable's office. Quite broken, he was, his face all pale and drawn. Such a devoted husband." Miss Marple's lips curved in the faintest of smiles, though her eyes remained fixed on her plate. Devotion, she knew, could be as much a mask as a truth. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen husbands weep convincingly at funerals, only to be found later with a motive as cold as the grave. Her thoughts turned to Geoffrey Denham, whom she had glimpsed briefly the previous evening, standing in the inn's doorway as Tregarth delivered the news. He had been impeccably dressed, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression one of studied grief, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, a certain polish to his sorrow, that had caught her attention. It was, she mused, almost too perfect, like a stage actor hitting his mark. The breakfast-room door swung open, admitting Constable Tregarth himself, his heavy boots thudding against the oak floor. He removed his helmet, revealing a forehead damp with sweat, and made his way to the innkeeper, Mr. Trewin, who stood polishing glasses behind the counter. Their conversation was low, but Miss Marple, with her knack for hearing what others missed, caught fragments. Inquest tomorrow. Coroners. Coming from Truro, no marks on the body, far as we can tell. Tregarth's voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to routine, yet uneasy with this particular death. Miss Marple set down her teacup and glanced toward Joyce Lempriere, who sat alone by the window, her sketchbook open but untouched. The young artist's face was pale, her auburn hair pulled back in a careless knot. Since her tale of the blood-stained pavement, Joyce had been subdued, her usual vivacity dimmed. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her later, for the girl's vision, fanciful or not, might hold a thread worth following. As breakfast ended, Miss Marple gathered her shawl and made her way to the village square, where the air smelled of salt and tar. Pereth was a small place, its cobbled streets winding between whitewashed cottages and shops that catered to fishermen and tourists alike. The quay, where Joyce had seen her vision, lay just beyond, its stones gleaming wet from a recent tide. But Miss Marple's destination was the constable's office, a squat building with a slate roof, where she hoped to learn more about the inquest. Tregarth was outside, speaking with Geoffrey Denham. The widower stood with his hands in his pockets, his dark suit immaculate despite the morning's damp. His face, handsome in a sharp, almost predatory way, was set in a mask of sorrow, but his eyes darted toward the sea as if seeking escape. Miss Marple approached slowly, her umbrella tapping the ground, her expression one of mild concern. "Good morning, Constable," she said, her voice soft but clear. "And Mr. Denham, is it? I am so very sorry for your loss. Such a shock for the village." Geoffrey turned, his smile quick and practiced. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she supplied, her eyes meeting his. "Jane Marple. I'm staying at the Pereth Arms, just a visitor, you know. But one does feel these tragedies, even as a stranger." "Kind of you," Geoffrey said, his voice smooth. "Carol loved this place, the sea, the cliffs. I can't think how it happened. She was so careful, always." Tregarth, shifting uncomfortably, nodded. It's a puzzle, Mr. Denham, but the coroner'll sort it out. Likely a slip, as I said. The cliffs are treacherous at night." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze lingering on Geoffrey. "Indeed, and was Mrs. Denham alone that evening?" "I do recall seeing her about the village. She had such a graceful way of walking." Geoffrey's smile tightened, though only for a moment. "She often walked alone," Miss Marple said. It cleared her mind. "I was at the inn myself, having a drink with some of the locals. I wish I'd gone with her." But his voice broke, and he looked away, his hand brushing his eyes. Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, but her mind was elsewhere. The inn, she knew, was crowded in the evenings, yet alibis could be slippery things. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a Man had claimed to be at a pub while his wife lay dying, only for a barmaid's memory to unravel his story. "Of course," she said, "one never expects such things. I do hope the inquest brings some clarity." As Tregarth and Geoffrey continued their conversation, Miss Marple excused herself and wandered toward the churchyard where the villagers' gossip often gathered. There, beneath the yew trees, she found Mrs. Trelawney, the fishmonger's wife, whose tongue was as sharp as her filleting knife. Mrs. Trelawney, bundled in a shawl despite the warmth, was eager to talk. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful?" she began, her eyes gleaming. "Mrs. Denham, dead like that, and her so young. Mind you, I never thought much of that husband of hers. All charm and no substance, if you ask me." Miss Marple smiled. Encouragingly, "Mr. Denham does seem very polished. I suppose they were a happy couple." Mrs. Trelawney snorted. "Happy? Not from what I saw. Argued like cats, they did, down by the cottage. I heard them myself, not 3 days ago. She was shouting about money, said he'd spent it all, or some such, and him telling her to keep her voice down, as if the whole village didn't know he's in debt up to his ears." "Dear me," Miss Marple said, her tone one of mild surprise. "Debt can be such a burden. Had they been in Pereth long?" 2 months, no more. "Came from London," they said, though you'd not know it from her clothes. Good quality, mind, but old. His were new, though always dressed like a gentleman, that one. Too fine for Pereth, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the details. Debt, arguments, a husband with a taste for finery. These were threads she had woven together before. She thanked Mrs. Trelawney and made her way back to the inn, her step slow but purposeful. That afternoon, the inquest was held in the village hall, a draughty building with rows of wooden chairs and a portrait of King George V frowning from the wall. Miss Marple, seated near the back, watched as the coroner, a thin man from Truro with a clipped voice, called witnesses. Dr. Haydock, the local physician, testified first, his report brief but precise. Carol Denham had drowned, he said, with no signs of violence. The body showed no bruises or cuts, save for minor abrasions likely caused by the rocks. The time of death was estimated at around 10 o'clock the previous night, based on the state of the body and the tide. Geoffrey Denham took the stand next, his voice steady but low. He spoke of Carol's love for evening walks, her habit of wandering the cliffs to watch the sunset. She was a strong swimmer, he said, his eyes downcast. "I never thought the sea could take her. I was at the inn until nearly midnight, talking with Mr. Trewin and some others. When I got home, she wasn't there. I assumed she'd stayed out late, as she sometimes did." The coroner nodded, jotting notes. "And you didn't think to look for her?" Geoffrey hesitated, his fingers tightening on the rail. "I should have, but it wasn't unusual for her to be out. I went to bed, thinking she'd be back by morning. When she wasn't, I alerted the constable." Miss Marple, her hands folded in her lap, listened intently. Geoffrey's story was plausible, yet something in his delivery, certain rehearsed qualities, struck her as false. She thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead who had lied about his whereabouts, his words smooth but his eyes betraying him. Geoffrey's eyes, she noted, rarely met the coroner's. The final witness was Tom Pengley, a fisherman whose boat was moored near the quay. He testified that he'd seen Carol on the cliffs earlier that evening, walking alone. She seemed fine, he said, his voice gruff, not hurrying or anything, just walking, looking out at the sea. The coroner, after a brief deliberation, delivered his verdict: death by misadventure. Carol Denham, he concluded, had likely slipped from the cliffs in the dark, her body carried by the tide. The room murmured its agreement, but Miss Marple remained silent, her thoughts elsewhere. Drowning, she knew, could hide many sins, and the absence of bruises did not preclude foul play. She recalled a case where a woman had been smothered before being placed in water, the lack of marks fooling all but the most persistent as the inquest ended. Miss Marple lingered, watching Geoffrey shake hands with Tregarth and accept condolences from the villagers. His manner was impeccable, his grief convincing to those who did not look too closely, but Miss Marple, who always looked closely, noted the faintest flicker of relief in his eyes as he turned away. Back at the Pereth Arms, she found Joyce Lempriere in the lounge, her sketchbook now filled with restless lines. "Miss Marple," Joyce said, her voice low, "do you think it was an accident? After what I saw those stones, the blood, I can't help wondering." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but reassuring. "My dear, we mustn't jump to conclusions. But I do think it curious, your vision coming so close to this tragedy. Tell me, who else was near the quay when you saw it?" Joyce frowned, thinking. There was Tom Pengelly mending his nets, and the grocer's boy delivering to the cottagers. Oh, and Mr. Denham. He passed by, heading toward the cliffs. He didn't stop, just nodded as he went. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained gentle. "How very interesting," she said. "We shall keep that in mind." As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the sea turn silver under the rising moon. The inquest had closed. One chapter, but another, she sensed, was beginning. Geoffrey Denham's polished grief, the whispers of debt. Joyce's strange vision, these were pieces of a puzzle she had solved before, in different forms. Pereth, like St. Mary Mead, was a place of secrets, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, intended to uncover them. Chapter 3. The artist's sketch. The sun rose over Pereth with a hesitant glow, as if reluctant to illuminate the village's newfound unease. The inquest's verdict of misadventure had quieted some tongues, but not all, and whispers of Carol Denham's death lingered like the mist that clung to the cliffs. At the Pereth Arms, the breakfast room was less sombre than the previous day, though an undercurrent of curiosity persisted. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her usual corner table, spread marmalade on her toast with the precision of a surgeon, her eyes flitting over the other guests. Her black lace mittens lay neatly folded beside her, and her knitting remained in its basket, for her mind was too occupied with the threads of suspicion to bother with wool. Joyce Lempriere, the young artist whose tale of a blood-stained pavement had first piqued Miss Marple's interest, sat across the room, her auburn hair catching the morning light. She was bent over her sketchbook, her pencil moving in short, agitated strokes. Since the inquest, Joyce had grown quieter, her usual flair subdued by the weight of the village's tragedy. Miss Marple, observing her, noted the faint crease between her brows, a sign, she knew, of a mind wrestling with something more than grief. The lounge was abuzz with the usual mix of holiday-makers and locals. Major Palgrave, his voice booming, was regaling Mrs. Babcock with a story of a near drowning in Calcutta, while Mrs. Babcock nodded with exaggerated sympathy, her pearls glinting as she leaned forward. At the counter, Mr. Trewin, the innkeeper, polished glasses with a distracted air, his ear tuned to the gossip. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, caught snatches of conversation: the cliff's dangers, Carol's solitary walks, and, inevitably, Geoffrey Denham's polished sorrow. The widower had not appeared at breakfast, a fact that sparked speculation among the guests. "Gone to Truro, I heard," Mrs. Babcock whispered to the Major, "arranging the funeral. Poor man." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly, though her expression remained placid. Geoffrey's absence was convenient, she thought, for a man who might wish to avoid scrutiny. Her mind turned to the inquest, where his account of the night Carol died had been smooth but curiously devoid of detail. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a husband's vague alibi had unravelled under the weight of small inconsistencies. Geoffrey, she sensed, was a man who relied on charm to deflect questions, but charm, in her experience, often hid a multitude of sins. Finishing her tea, Miss Marple rose and approached Joyce, her steps soft against the oak floor. "Good morning, my dear," she said, her voice warm but measured. "I see you're sketching again. Might I have a look? Your work yesterday was so evocative." Joyce started, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." She hesitated, then slid the sketchbook across the table. "It's nothing special, just trying to make sense of things." Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite, her spectacles glinting as she examined the page. The sketch depicted the quay's cobbled pavement, rendered with meticulous care. Each stone was outlined in sharp detail, their edges worn smooth by centuries of tides and boots. The perspective was low, as if Joyce had been seated on the ground, capturing the texture of the cobbles and the faint sheen of seawater. There was no trace of blood, no mark to suggest the vision Joyce had described. Yet the drawing held a strange intensity, as if the artist had been searching for something beyond the visible. "How remarkable," Miss Marple said, her tone encouraging. "You've caught the very spirit of the place. And this is from the day you saw what you saw." Joyce nodded, her fingers twisting a strand of hair. "Yes, that afternoon, I was sitting there, just sketching, when it happened. The blood, it was so real, Miss Marple, like it was seeping up from the stones. I thought I'd gone mad, but it vanished as quickly as it came." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen behind her spectacles. "And you're certain it was the pavement itself, not, perhaps, a reflection or something in the air?" Joyce shook her head vehemently. "No, it was the stones. I looked all around, there was nothing else. Just the quay, the sea, and a few people passing by. People." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but her interest sharpened. "Do tell me, my dear, who was there? One does notice the smallest details, even when one doesn't mean to." Joyce frowned, her brow creasing. As she thought back, let's see. There was Tom Pengley, the fisherman, down by his boat, mending nets. He's always there, like part of the scenery. And the grocer's boy Jimmy, I think his name, is carrying a basket to the cottages. Oh, and Mr. Denham. He walked past, heading toward the cliffs. He was in a hurry, didn't even look at me, just gave a quick nod." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly on the sketchbook, though her face remained serene. "Mr. Denham, you say? How very interesting. And what time was this, would you say?" "About 4 o'clock, maybe a little after." The light was starting to soften, perfect for sketching. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Geoffrey Denham, passing the quay mere hours before his wife's death, his manner distracted. It was a small detail, yet in her experience, small details often formed the pattern of a crime. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a grocer's delivery boy had seen a man lingering near a crime scene, a fact that proved pivotal. "You've a good eye, my dear," she said, patting Joyce's hand. "This sketch may be more important than you know." Joyce's eyes widened. "You think it means something? About Mrs. Denham, I mean." "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we must keep our minds open. Visions, you know, are sometimes the mind's way of seeing what the eyes miss. Now, may I borrow this sketch for a little while? I promise to return it." Joyce hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, just be careful with it. It's all I have of that moment." Miss Marple tucked the sketchbook under her arm and rose, her umbrella tapping the floor as she made her way to the inn's porch. The air outside was heavy with the scent of salt and kelp, and the quay lay just a short walk away. She decided to see it for herself, to stand where Joyce had stood and test the ground, as it were, for clues. Her black brogues, sensible but polished, carried her down the cobbled street, past the fishmonger's stall and the bakery, where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the tang of the sea. The quay was quieter than usual, the fishermen having set out at dawn and the tourists not yet stirred from their breakfasts. The pavement, as Joyce had drawn it, stretched along the water's edge, its stones uneven but gleaming under a thin film of seawater. Miss Marple paused, her umbrella planted firmly in the ground, and studied the scene. The tide was low, exposing a strip of shingle below, where gulls pecked at scraps of seaweed. To the left, the cliffs rose sharply, their paths winding toward the cottage where Carol and Geoffrey had lived. To the right, the harbour curved, dotted with boats bobbing gently on their moorings. She opened the sketchbook, holding it up to compare the drawing with the reality. Joyce's perspective was exact, capturing the angle of the stones and the curve of the quay with an artist's precision. Miss Marple lowered herself carefully to a bench, mindful of her rheumatism, and imagined Joyce sitting there, her pencil flying across the page. The vision of blood, she mused, could have been a trick of light, a shadow, or even a memory triggered by something Joyce had seen but not consciously noted. But her instinct, honed by years of unravelling village mysteries, told her it was more a glimpse, perhaps, of a truth yet to be uncovered. Her thoughts were interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Trelawney, the fishmonger's wife, whose stall stood nearby. Mrs. Trelawney, her shawl flapping in the breeze, was a woman whose gossip was as plentiful as her mackerel. "Morning, Miss Marple," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "Out for a stroll, are you? Terrible business, that Mrs. Denham. They're saying it was an accident, but I've my doubts." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of polite interest. "Good morning, Mrs. Trelawney. Yes, quite a tragedy. You were here the day Miss Lempriere was sketching, I believe. She mentioned seeing you." Mrs. Trelawney's eyes gleamed, delighted to be part of the narrative. "Oh, I saw her, sitting there with her pencils, looking all dreamy. She's a queer one, that girl, always seeing things. But that day, let me think, was busy enough, fishermen coming and going, and that Mr. Denham striding past like he owned the place. Mr. Denham." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her interest quickened. "Did he stop or speak to anyone?" "Not a word," Mrs. Trelawney said, leaning closer. "Just marched by, head down, toward the cliffs. Looked like a man with a purpose, if you ask me." And not an hour later, young Joyce was packing up in a hurry, white as a sheet. "Said she'd seen something odd, but I thought it was just her." "Nerves?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the timeline. "Geoffrey, passing the quay at 4, heading toward the cliffs, where Carol was later found dead. Joyce's vision, coming moments after. It was a sequence that bore scrutiny. "And Mrs. Denham," she said, "did you see her that day?" Mrs. Trelawney pursed her lips. "Not on the quay, no, but I saw her the night before, outside there. Cottage, arguing with him, she was, her voice sharp as a knife. Something about money, and him promising it'd be sorted. She didn't believe him, you could tell. Walked off in a huff, she did, toward the village." "Dear me," Miss Marple said, her eyes wide with just the right touch of surprise. "How distressing for them. One does hear of such troubles in marriages, though." Mrs. Trelawney snorted. "Troubles, that man's trouble, mark my words. Always flashing his smile, but there's no warmth in it. And those debts of his, everyone knows he's been dodging creditors since they got here." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind already weaving the new information into the pattern. She rose, the sketchbook still under her arm, and walked slowly along the quay, her eyes scanning the pavement. The stones, she noted, were tightly packed, with no cracks where blood could pool, even in imagination. Yet Joyce's vision had been vivid, specific. Miss Marple paused, her umbrella tapping the ground, and considered the possibility that the artist had seen not blood, but something else, a gesture, a glance, a moment of guilt that her mind had translated into a symbol as she turned back toward the inn. She spotted Jimmy, the grocer's boy, pedaling his bicycle along the street. He was a lanky lad of 16, with freckles and a shy grin, and Miss Marple waved him over. "Good morning, Jimmy," she said, her voice warm. "I hear you were at the quay the other day, delivering for Mr. Poldark. You must see all sorts in your rounds." Jimmy blushed, dismounting his bicycle. "I, miss, always busy, I am. Saw that artist lady, Miss Lempriere, drawing like she was in a trance, and Mr. Denham, too, going past quick-like." "Did you, now?" Miss Marple's tone was encouraging. "And was he alone, or carrying anything?" Jimmy scratched his head. "Alone, I think. Didn't stop to chat, just kept walking, looked like he was in a mood, though face all tight, you know." Miss Marple smiled, slipping him a shilling for his trouble. "You're a sharp lad, Jimmy. Keep your eyes open, won't you?" As Jimmy pedalled off, Miss Marple made her way back to the Pereth Arms, the sketchbook a weight under her arm. The key had given her no physical clues, but the conversations had added texture to her suspicions. Geoffrey's presence, his haste, the argument with Carol, the whispers of debt, these were not proof, but they were pointers, like the first stitches in a complex pattern. Joyce's sketch, she sensed, was more than art. It was a window into a moment when something had shifted. Perhaps in Geoffrey's mind, perhaps in the village's fate. Back at the inn, she found Joyce in the lounge, sipping tea and looking less pale. "Miss Marple," Joyce said, "did the sketch help? I've been thinking about it, and I'm sure I didn't imagine it. It was too real." Miss Marple settled beside her, returning the sketchbook. "My dear, I believe you saw something, even if we don't yet know what. Your artist's eye is a gift, it sees what others miss. We shall keep watching, you and I, and perhaps the pavement will tell us its secret." As Joyce nodded, her face brightening, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind already turning to the next step. The quay, the cliffs, the cottage, she would visit them all, piecing together the hours before Carol's death. Geoffrey Denham, with his charm and his debts, was at the center of this puzzle, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, intended to unravel him. Chapter 4. The insurance policy. The fourth day in Pereth, dawned with a deceptive calm, the sea sparkling under a sky swept clean of clouds, as if the village sought to shrug off the shadow of Carol Denham's death. At the Pereth Arms, the breakfast room hummed with the clink of china and the murmur of voices, though the gaiety of earlier days had not returned. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her favoured corner table, stirred her tea with a silver spoon, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet alertness of a bird. Her black lace mittens lay beside her, and her knitting remained untouched in its wicker basket, for her thoughts were wholly occupied with the puzzle of the key and the tragedy it had foreshadowed. The inquest's verdict of misadventure had satisfied many, but not Miss Marple. She had seen too many convenient accidents in St. Mary Mead to accept such a tidy explanation without scrutiny. Her mind turned to Geoffrey Denham, whose polished grief and hasty movements on the day of Joyce's vision had lodged in her memory like a burr. The whispers of his debts, gleaned from Mrs. Trelawney, and the timing of his presence near the quay, reported by Joyce and young Jimmy, formed a pattern that demanded exploration. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beneath the surface, suspected that Carol's death was no mere slip on a cliff, but a deliberate act cloaked in circumstance. Across the room, Joyce Lempriere sat with her sketchbook closed, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she sipped coffee. The artist's nervous energy had softened since her conversation with Miss Marple, as if the act of sharing her vision had lightened her burden. Major Palgrave, at another table, was expounding on the perils of Cornish tides to a weary Mrs. Babcock, who nodded absently, her mind clearly elsewhere. The innkeeper, Mr. Trewin, moved among the tables, refilling teapots with a practised smile, but Miss Marple noted the tightness in his jaw sign. She thought that even he sensed the village's unease. As she finished her toast, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a new piece of gossip, delivered by the inn's maid, Lily, a rosy-cheeked girl with a penchant for eavesdropping. Lily, clearing plates from a nearby table, leaned toward Mrs. Babcock and whispered, "They're saying Mr. Denham's come into money, ma'am. Something about a policy taken out on his wife. My cousin works at the bank, and she heard it from Mr. Penrose himself." Mrs. Babcock's eyes widened, her pearls clicking as she turned. An insurance policy. Good heavens, Lily, how much? Lily glanced around, then lowered her voice. A tidy sum, they say. Enough to clear his debts, and then some. He's been to Truro, sorting it all out. Miss Marple's spoon paused mid-stir, though her expression remained serene. An insurance policy was precisely the sort of detail that could shift a tragedy into a crime. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a man who insured his wife's life before pushing her down a well. His tears at the inquest as false as his ledgers. She made a mental note to visit the bank, where Mr. Penrose, the manager, was an old acquaintance. From a long-ago holiday in Bournemouth, his discretion, she knew, could be gently persuaded by a shared memory and a glass of sherry. Rising from her table, Miss Marple gathered her shawl and umbrella, her brogues tapping softly as she made her way to the lounge. There she found Joyce, who looked up with a tentative smile. "Miss Marple, are you off to the quay again? I could come with you, if you like. I've been thinking about that sketch, and I'm sure there's something I missed." Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch light but reassuring. "Not today, my dear, though I may call on you later. I've a little errand in the village, but do keep your eyes open. You've a gift for seeing what others don't." Joyce nodded, her expression earnest, and Miss Marple stepped into the morning light, her umbrella a steadfast companion despite the clear sky. The village was awake, its streets bustling with fishermen hauling nets and shopkeepers sweeping doorsteps. The bank, a modest building with a brass plaque, stood at the far end of the square, its windows reflecting the harbour's gleam. Miss Marple's steps were slow but purposeful, her mind already framing the questions she would ask. Inside, the bank was cool and quiet, its oak counterpolished to a mirror shine. Mr. Penrose, a portly man with a walrus moustache, greeted her. With a surprised smile, "Miss Marple, what a pleasure to see you again. It's been 10 years since Bournemouth?" 11, I believe, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But you haven't changed a bit, Mr. Penrose. I'm only passing through Pereth, but I couldn't resist a chat. Might we have a word in private?" Mr. Penrose, flattered by her warmth, ushered her into his office, a small room lined with ledgers and smelling faintly of ink. He poured 2 glasses of sherry from a decanter, and they settled into leather chairs, the ritual of old acquaintance. "Easing the way now, Miss Marple," he said. "What brings you here? Not just nostalgia, I'll wager." Miss Marple sipped her sherry, her expression one of mild concern. "You're quite right, Mr. Penrose. It's this sad business with Mrs. Denham. The village is all at with her, and I've heard whispers, nothing concrete, mind you, about an insurance policy. One does worry about poor Mr. Denham, left with such burdens." Mr. Penrose's moustache twitched, a sign Miss Marple knew that he was weighing his words. "You've a sharp ear, Miss Marple, as ever. Yes, there's a policy, taken out in London some months ago. A substantial one, I'm afraid, £20,000, payable to Mr. Denham upon his wife's death. He's been in touch with the insurers, and the claim is being processed. Should clear his debts, and more." Miss Marple's eyes widened, though her surprise was carefully calibrated. £20,000. Dear me, that's a fortune. And taken out recently, you say? 6 months ago, just before they came to Pereth, Mr. Penrose said, his voice low. "I shouldn't say more, but well, Mr. Denham's accounts have been strained for some time. Overdrafts, unpaid bills, creditors circling the policies. Payout will be a lifeline, no question." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. £20,000 was motive enough for murder, especially for a man drowning in debt. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a shopkeeper had insured his partner's life before staging a robbery gone wrong. The timing of Geoffrey's policy, so close to their move to Pereth, suggested premeditation. "One does hear of such policies," she said, "but it's so tragic when they're needed. Poor Mr. Denham must be beside himself." Mr. Penrose sighed, swirling his sherry. "He puts on a brave face, but I've seen men in his position before. Gambling, mostly that's what's done him in. Cards, horses, you name it. He's been dodging creditors for years, from what I hear." Miss Marple thanked him, her tone warm but her thoughts already elsewhere. As she left the bank, the weight of the insurance policy settled in her mind, a cornerstone in the edifice of suspicion she was building. Geoffrey's debts, his charm, his presence at the keyhole pointed to a man with both motive and opportunity. But proof, she knew, was another matter, requiring the patience of a knitter untangling a knot. Her next stop was the post office, where Miss Pollitt, the postmistress, was a fount of village lore. Miss Pollitt, a wiry woman with pince-nez and a love of scandal, was sorting letters when Miss Marple entered, her umbrella tapping the floor. "Good morning, Miss Pollitt," she said, her voice bright. "I'm just sending a postcard to my niece, but I couldn't help overhearing talk about poor Mrs. Denham. Such a shock for the village." Miss Pollitt's eyes gleamed, her fingers pausing mid-sort. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful, isn't it? And that husband of hers, all tears and fine clothes. I've seen his type before, smooth as silk, but trouble underneath." Miss Marple leaned closer, her tone conspiratorial. "One does wonder about him. I heard something about money troubles, and now this insurance business. It's all so very sad." Miss Pollitt needed no further prompting. "Money troubles, huh? He's been sending telegrams to London, begging for extensions on loans. And that policy my friend at the Truro office says it's the talk of the town. Taken out in a rush, it was, and now he's set to pocket a fortune. If you ask me, it's too convenient." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle shock. "How extraordinary. And Mrs. Denham, did she know about the policy, do you think?" Miss Pollitt shrugged. "Hard to say. But she came in here once, posting a letter to a lawyer in London. Looked worried, she did, and kept glancing over her shoulder. I reckon she knew more than she let on, as Miss Marple purchased her postcard. Her mind catalogued the details. A policy taken out in haste. A wife possibly aware of her husband's plans. A marriage strained by debt and deceit. She thanked Miss Pollitt and stepped back into the sunlight. Her umbrella a steady rhythm against the cobbles. Her thoughts were interrupted by a chance encounter with Dr. Haydock, the physician who had testified at the inquest. He was striding toward the harbour, his medical bag swinging, and Miss Marple hailed him with a wave. "Dr. Haydock, a moment, if you please. I've been thinking about poor Mrs. Denham, and I wondered if you might clarify something for me." Dr. Haydock, a bluff man with a kind face, paused, his brow creasing. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Happy to help, though there's little to add. Drowning, plain and simple, with no marks to suggest otherwise." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen. "Quite so, but I've read that drowning can be deceptive sometimes. In St. Mary Mead, we had a case where a woman was thought to have drowned, but later they found she'd been unconscious first. No marks, you see, but a different story altogether." Dr. Haydock's expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "An interesting point. I'll admit, the autopsy was quick village resources, you know. No water in the lungs, which suggests she was dead before she hit the water, but that's not uncommon with a fall. Shock or a broken neck can kill instantly." Miss Marple nodded, her mind seizing on the detail. No water in the lungs, a fact that could mean Carol was not drowned by the sea, but by another hand. "How very helpful," she said. "One does like to understand these things, even if they're distressing." As Dr. Haydock hurried off, Miss Marple made her way to the cliffs, where the path to the Denhams' cottage wound through gorse and heather. The cottage, a low stone building with a slate roof, stood alone, its windows dark. She did not enter such. Boldness was not her way, but she studied the surroundings, noting the proximity to the cliff's edge, a mere 50 yards away. A strong man, she thought, could carry a body to the rocks below, especially under cover of darkness. The tide, she recalled from a chart at the inn, had been low that night, making such a task feasible. Returning to the Pereth Arms, she found Joyce in the lounge, her sketchbook open to a new drawing of the cliffs. "Miss Marple," Joyce said, her voice low, "I heard about the insurance. Do you think, could Mr. Denham have done something?" Miss Marple settled beside her, her tone gentle but firm. "We mustn't speculate, my dear, but we can observe. The insurance is a fact, and facts, like your sketches, have a way of revealing the truth. Tell me, "Have you seen Mr. Denham today?" Joyce shook her head. "Not since yesterday, but Lily, the maid, said he's been asking about boats, wanting to leave Pereth soon." "It's odd, isn't it? So soon after." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her smile remained. "Very odd indeed. We shall keep that in mind." As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the sea a silver ribbon under the moon. The insurance policy, the debts, the empty lungs. The cottage by the cliffs, these were threads in a tapestry of deceit, and Geoffrey Denham, she suspected, was the weaver. But suspicion was not proof, and proof required patience. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a similar case had hinged on a single overlooked detail. Pereth, she resolved, would yield its secrets, and she, with her quiet persistence, would find them. Chapter 5. The Fisherman's Tale. The fifth morning in Pereth broke with a restless wind, rattling the shutters of the Pereth Arms and sending whitecaps skittering across the harbour. The village, though accustomed to the sea's moods, seemed to mirror its agitation, as if Carol Denham's death had stirred currents deeper than the tide. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her corner table in the inn's breakfast room, sliced her boiled egg with precision, her eyes flitting over the other guests with the quiet vigilance of a sentinel. Her black lace mittens rested beside her teacup, and her knitting lay untouched in its wicker basket, for her mind was too engrossed in the web of clues to spare a thought for wool. The insurance policy, revealed by Mr. Penrose and amplified by Miss Pollett's gossip, had hardened Miss Marple's suspicions into something tangible. £20,000 was a motive that could turn a husband's hand against his wife, especially one burdened by gambling debts and creditors' demands. Dr. Haydock's admission about the absence of water in Carol's lungs had added a chilling possibility that she had not drowned in the sea, but had been dead before the waves claimed her. These facts, combined with Geoffrey Denham's hurried presence at the quay and Joyce Lempriere's unsettling vision, formed a pattern that Miss Marple recognized from past cases in St. Mary Mead. Yet patterns, she knew, were not proof, and proof demanded diligence. The breakfast room was quieter than usual. The guests subdued by the wind and the lingering weight of the inquest's verdict. Major Palgrave, for once, was absent, perhaps deterred by the weather, and Mrs. Babcock sat, alone, her pearls glinting as she nibbled a scone. Joyce Lempriere, at a window table, was sketching absently, her auburn hair tucked behind her ears. Her face, Miss Marple noted, was less strained than before, as if her talks with the elderly sleuth had eased her fears. The innkeeper, Mr. Trewin, moved among the tables with a tray of teapots, his usual cheer tempered by a furrowed brow. Miss Marple, catching his eye, offered a nod, her mind already planning her next move. Her thoughts were interrupted by a snippet of conversation from Lily, the maid, who was clearing plates nearby. "They're saying Mr. Denham's been down at the harbour," Lily whispered to Mrs. Babcock, her voice low but audible to Miss Marple's sharp ears, "talking to old Tom Pengley about his boat. Wants to hire it, or so I heard. Odd, him thinking of sailing so soon." Mrs. Babcock's eyes widened, her scone forgotten. "Sailing? Good heavens, Lily, his wife's barely cold. What's he up to?" Lily shrugged, stacking plates. "Dunno, ma'am, but Tom wasn't keen." Said Mr. Denham looked nervy, kept glancing about like he was being watched. Miss Marple's teaspoon paused, though her expression remained placid. Geoffrey's interest in a boat, so soon after Carol's death, was a detail that fit uneasily with his role as a grieving widower. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a man had planned to flee by sea after poisoning his aunt, only to be caught by a fisherman's sharp memory. Tom Pengelly, the weathered fisherman Joyce had seen at the quay, might hold a key to Geoffrey's intentions. Miss Marple resolved to speak with him, for fishermen, in her experience, saw more than they said. Finishing her tea, she gathered her shawl and umbrella, her brogues tapping softly as she stepped into the lounge. Joyce looked up from her sketch, a faint smile crossing her face. "Miss Marple, are you braving the wind? I was thinking of sketching the harbour today, but it's so blustery." Miss Marple paused, her eyes twinkling. "A little wind never hurt anyone, my dear, though I'd advise a scarf. I'm off to the harbour myself. Perhaps we'll cross paths later. Your sketches, you know, have been most illuminating." Joyce blushed, her fingers tightening on her pencil. "You really think so? I've been wondering if I should draw the key again, see if it happens again." Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch light but reassuring. "Do what feels right, but don't force it. Sometimes the truth comes when we least expect it. Now, keep warm, and we'll talk soon." Stepping outside, Miss Marple braced against the wind, her umbrella serving as a cane rather than a shield, for the sky was clear despite the gusts. The village streets were lively, with fishermen hauling gear and shopkeepers securing awnings against the breeze. The harbour, a crescent of stone and shingle, was her destination, where Tom Pengelly's boat, the Sea Witch, was moored among a dozen others. Miss Marple's steps were slow but steady, her black brogues navigating the cobbles with care. The air smelled of tar and brine, and gulls wheeled overhead. Their cries, sharp against the winds, howled at the harbour. She spotted Tom Pengelly at once, his weathered figure unmistakable. He was crouched beside his boat, a sturdy skiff with peeling paint, mending a net with hands gnarled by years at sea. His face, lined like a chart, was set in a scowl, though it softened as Miss Marple approached, her shawl fluttering like a flag. "Good morning, Mr. Pengelly," she said, her voice clear despite the wind. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm Jane Marple, staying at the Pereth Arms. Such a lovely harbour you have here." Tom straightened, wiping his hands on his oilskin. "Mornin', miss. Ain't much lovely today, with this gale. What brings you out? Not many take to the docks in such weather." Miss Marple smiled, her spectacles glinting. "Oh, I enjoy a bit of fresh air, and I've heard you're the man to talk to about the sea. I was at the inquest, you know, and your testimony about Mrs. Denham was so helpful. It's such a sad affair." Tom's scowl returned, his eyes narrowing. "Aye, sad enough. Didn't see much, though, just her on the cliffs, walking as she did. Never thought she'd end up in the sea." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "Of course, but one does wonder about that night. I heard Mr. Denham was about to, perhaps near the cliffs. You must see all sorts, working here." Tom hesitated, his fingers tightening on the net. "Denham, I saw him that night, not far from the cliffs, round 9 or so. Looked edgy, he did pacin' like a caged dog, kept looking at the sea, then back at the path, didn't speak. To me, just went on his way." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. Geoffrey, agitated, and neared the cliffs, hours before Carol's body was found. It was a detail that fit neatly into her suspicions. "How curious," she said. "And was he alone, or carrying anything, perhaps?" Tom scratched his chin, his eyes distant. "Alone, far as I could tell. No bag or such, just his coat flappin'. in the wind, but his boat, that skiff he keeps caught my eye later, was moored out by the point, not in its usual spot. Odd, that, for a calm night. Miss Marple's mind seized on the detail, her thoughts racing. A boat moved from its usual mooring could mean nothing or everything. She recalled a case where a murderer had used a dinghy to dispose of evidence, only to be betrayed by a tide table. A boat out of place, she said, is rather like a stitch dropped in knitting, don't you think? It pulls at the hole. Pattern, Tom grunted, clearly unused to such metaphors. Maybe so. Didn't think much of it till now. But he's been sniffing round again, asking to hire my sea witch. Wanted her for a day, said he needed to clear his head. I told him, no, don't trust him. Not after all this. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. A wise decision, Mr. Pengley. One can't be too careful. Did he say where he meant to go? Didn't say, and I didn't ask. Just looked nervy, like he was itching to be gone. Kept checking his watch, too, like he had somewhere to be. Miss Marple thanked him, her tone warm but her mind already weaving the new threads into her tapestry. Geoffrey's agitation, his boat's unusual position, his sudden interest in sailing, these were not the actions of a man at peace with his grief. She bid Tom farewell and turned back toward the village, her umbrella tapping the quay's stones. As she pondered her next move, her thoughts were interrupted by Joyce, who appeared at the harbour's edge, her sketchbook tucked under her arm and a scarf battling the wind. "Miss Marple," she called, hurrying over. "I couldn't stay away, the harbour's so dramatic today. Did you find anything?" Miss Marple smiled, shielding her eyes from the gusts. "Only a few small things, my dear, but they add up. Like your sketches. Have you heard anything new about Mr. Denham?" Joyce's face clouded. "Just what Lily said, he's been asking about boats. And last night, at the inn, I overheard him on the telephone, talking to someone in London. He sounded urgent, saying he'd have the money soon and to hold off. I didn't catch it all, but it gave me chills." Miss Marple's lips pursed, though her expression remained gentle. "How very interesting. One does wonder what money he means, with the insurance still pending. You've a good ear, Joyce, as well as a good eye." Joyce flushed, clutching her sketchbook. "I don't know if it means anything, but after what I saw, the blood, I mean, I can't help feeling he's hiding something." Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch steadying. "We shall see, my dear. For now, keep sketching and keep listening. The truth has a way of surfacing like a cork in the tide." As Joyce headed toward the quay, Miss Marple made her way to the village square, where the wind tugged at shop signs and scattered leaves across the cobbles. Her next stop was the cottage where Carol and Geoffrey had lived, a place she had only glimpsed from the cliffs. She did not intend to trespass, but a closer look might reveal something, a detail, a trace that the constable's cursory search had missed. The cottage stood at the village's edge, its stone walls weathered by salt and time, its garden overgrown with thrift and sea pinks. The windows were shuttered, and the door bore a padlock, but Miss Marple circled slowly, her eyes scanning the ground near the back, where the cliff path began. She noticed a patch of disturbed earth, as if something heavy had been dragged. It was faint, easily overlooked, but to Miss Marple's practiced eye it was a sign. She crouched, mindful of her rheumatism, and examined the soil. No blood, no clear marks, but the grass was flattened, leading toward the cliff's edge. She straightened, her mind conjuring an image, a body carried or dragged under cover of darkness to be cast into the sea. The low tide, she recalled, would have made the rocks accessible, a perfect stage for an accident. Her inspection was cut short by the approach of Mrs. Trelawney, who appeared with a basket of fish, her shawl flapping like a sail. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice carrying over the wind. "What are you doing out here? That cottage is empty now, with him staying at the inn." Miss Marple smiled, brushing dirt from her gloves. "Just a walk, Mrs. Trelawney, to clear my head. The view from here is quite striking, don't you think?" Mrs. Trelawney snorted, setting her basket down. "View? More like a death trap, those cliffs. I saw Mrs. Denham there often, walking alone, looking like she carried the world's woes, and him never with her, always off somewhere, scheming. I reckon." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone was mild. "Mr. Denham does seem a busy man. I heard he's been at the harbour, talking of boats. One wonders what he's planning." Mrs. Trelawney's face darkened. "Boats, is it? He's up to no good, mark my words. I saw him myself, night before. She died, comin' back from the cliffs with his coat all muddy. Said he'd slipped, but I didn't believe it. Too slick, that one." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though she kept her voice steady. "Muddy, you say? How curious. The paths were dry that evening, were they not?" "Aye, dry as bone," Mrs. Trelawney said, nodding. "Made me think he'd been somewhere he shouldn't, but I kept my mouth shut, didn't want trouble." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind cataloguing the detail. A muddy coat, a low tide, a disturbed patch of earth. As Mrs. Trelawney trudged off, Miss Marple returned to the inn, her umbrella a rhythm against the wind. The fisherman's tale, Joyce's eavesdropping, the cottage's silent cluesies, were stitches in a pattern that pointed to Geoffrey Denham. But the pattern was incomplete, and Miss Marple, with her quiet tenacity, knew she must find the missing threads. Back at the Pereth Arms, she found Joyce in the lounge, her sketchbook open to a new drawing of the harbour, the boats tossed by the wind. "Miss Marple," Joyce said, her voice low, "I've been thinking about what you said about the truth surfacing. Do you think, could Mr. Denham have hurt her?" Miss Marple settled beside her, her eyes kind but keen. "We mustn't rush to judgment, my dear, but we can follow where the facts lead. You've been most helpful, and I suspect you'll see more before this is done. For now, keep your sketches close and your ears open." As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the sea a restless shadow beyond. The fisherman's tale had tightened the net around Geoffrey, but the truth, she knew, was still submerged. Pereth, like St. Mary Mead, held its secrets close, but Miss Marple, with her patient unravelling, was determined to bring them to light. Chapter 6. The Tide's Secret. The 6th day in Pereth greeted the village with a deceptive stillness, the wind of the previous day having subsided to a gentle breeze that barely stirred the harbour's waters. The sea, glassy under a pale morning sky, seemed to mock the turmoil that had settled over the village since Carol Denham's death. At the Pereth Arms, the breakfast room was quieter than usual, the guests' chatter subdued by the weight of unanswered questions. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her customary corner table, buttered her toast with deliberate care, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Her black-laced mittens lay folded beside her teacup, and her knitting remained in its wicker basket, for her mind was too occupied with the puzzle of the key and the clues that had begun to surface. Tom Pengelly's account of Geoffrey Denham's agitation near the cliffs, coupled with the fisherman's observation of the misplaced skiff, had added a new layer to Miss Marple's suspicions. The insurance policy, the whispers of debt, the absence of water in Carol's lungs, and now the muddy coat seen by Mrs. Trelawney pointed to a man whose grief was a carefully crafted facade. Joyce Lempriere's vision of blood, though still unexplained, seemed to Miss Marple a subconscious glimpse of a truth that the village had yet to acknowledge. In St. Mary Mead, she had solved cases with less to go on, piecing together fragments of gossip and observation until the pattern emerged. Pereth, she sensed, was no different, though its secrets were buried deeper, like shells beneath the tide. The breakfast room held its usual cast. Joyce, sketching absently at a window table, her auburn hair catching the light. Mrs. Babcock, fussing with her pearls and whispering to a bored-looking Mr. Trewin, and a handful of tourists, their voices low as they discussed the tragedy. Major Palgrave was absent, perhaps nursing a cold brought on by the previous day's wind. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, caught a snippet of conversation from Lily, the maid, who was clearing plates nearby. "Mr. Denham's been up early," Lily murmured to Mrs. Babcock. "Saw him at the cottage, packing things. Says he's leaving soon, once the funeral's done." Mrs. Babcock's eyes widened, her scone crumbling in her hand. "Leaving so soon? Why, the poor man's barely had time to mourn." Lily shrugged, stacking plates. "Dunno, ma'am, but he was in a rush, like he couldn't wait to be gone. Had a suitcase and all, stuffing it with papers." Miss Marple's teaspoon paused, though her expression remained serene. Geoffrey's haste to depart so soon after Carol's death was a thread that tugged at her suspicions. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a widower's sudden departure had led to the discovery of a forged will. Packing papers, Lily had said, perhaps documents related to the insurance policy, or something more incriminating. Miss Marple resolved to learn more, but first, she needed to understand the mechanics of Carol's death, particularly the role of the sea and the cliffs. Rising from her table, she gathered her shawl and umbrella, her brogues tapping softly as she made her way to the inn's lounge. There she found Joyce, who looked up with a tentative smile. "Miss Marple, are you off again? I was thinking of sketching the cliffs today, the light's so clear." Miss Marple paused, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "A fine idea, my dear, but do take a coat, it's cooler than it looks. I'm heading to the harbour myself to check a little something. Your sketches have been most helpful, you know. Perhaps we'll compare notes later." Joyce nodded, her fingers tightening on her pencil. "I hope so. I keep thinking about that blood, Miss Marple. It's like it's trying to tell me something, but I can't make it out." Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch light but reassuring. "Patience, Joyce. The truth is like a tide, it comes in its own time. Keep your eyes open, and we'll see what surfaces." Stepping outside, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl against the morning chill and made her way to the harbour, where the tide charts were kept in the harbour master's office, a weathered shack near the quay. The charts, she knew, could reveal whether the sea had been an accomplice in Carol's death or a convenient scapegoat. The harbour master, a grizzled man named Iago, was sorting ropes when she arrived, his pipe sending curls of smoke into the air. "Mornin', miss," he said, eyeing her curiously. "Not often we get visitors like you here. What's on your mind?" Miss Marple smiled, her umbrella planted firmly in the shingle. "Good morning, Mr. Iago. I'm Jane Marple, just a visitor at the Pereth Arms. I've been reading about tides, fascinating things, aren't they? I wondered if I might see the chart for the night poor Mrs. Denham died." One does like to understand these tragedies. Jago's brow furrowed, but he nodded, leading her into the shack. The chart, pinned to a wall beside a barometer, was a grid of numbers and times, incomprehensible to the untrained eye. Iago traced a finger along the relevant date. That night, let's see, tide was low round 9, starting to come. In by 11 means the rocks below the cliffs were exposed for a good while. Easy enough to walk down there if you know the path. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. A low tide meant the cliff's base was accessible, a fact that could explain the disturbed earth she'd seen near the cottage. How very helpful, she said. And would a boat, say, need to navigate carefully at such a time? Iago puffed. His pipe, considering, not much. Water's shallow near the rocks, but a small skiff could manage, specially one like Denham's, mind you. Ain't many take a boat out at night, lest they've reason. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. A low tide, an accessible cliff base, a skiff moored out of place. These were pieces of a method, chilling in its simplicity. She recalled a case where a man had drowned his wife in a pond before moving her to a river, the tide erasing his tracks. Could Geoffrey have done something similar, subduing Carol in the cottage and staging her death as a fall? The absence of water in her lungs, as Dr. Haydock had noted, suggested she was dead before the sea touched her, a detail that now loomed large. Her next stop was the cliffs themselves, where the path from the Denhams' cottage wound through gorse and heather. The wind was gentle, but the drop to the rocks below was stark, a reminder of the sea's indifference. Miss Marple, mindful of her rheumatism, moved slowly, her umbrella a steadying force. She paused where the path narrowed, her eyes scanning the ground. The disturbed earth she'd noticed yesterday was still there, faint but unmistakable, leading toward the cliff's edge. She crouched, her gloves protecting her hands, and examined the soil. No blood, no clear footprints, but the grass was crushed, as if something or someone had been dragged. Straightening, she gazed at the rocks below, where seaweed clung like dark hair. A strong man, she thought, could carry a body down the path at low tide, placing it among the rocks to suggest a fall. The incoming tide would do the rest, washing away any trace of struggle. She recalled Dr. Haydock's mention of minor abrasions on Carol's body, attributed to the rocks. But what if those marks were from something else? Rope, perhaps, or a rough handling before death? Her thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of footsteps, and she turned to see Joyce approaching, her sketchbook under her arm. Miss Marple, Joyce called, her scarf fluttering. I saw you from the path. Are you looking for something? Miss Marple smiled, brushing dirt from her gloves. Just thinking, my dear, about tides and cliffs. You're sketching here, I see. Anything new? Catch your eye? Joyce hesitated, then opened her sketchbook to a rough drawing of the cliff path, the rocks below rendered in stark lines. I don't know why, but I felt drawn here. It's like the place is trying to tell me something. But all I see is the sea and the stones. Miss Marple studied the sketch, her eyes lingering on the angle of the path. You've a remarkable gift, Joyce. This is exactly where I've been standing. Tell me, have you heard anything more about Mr. Denham? Joyce's face clouded. Only what Lily said at breakfast about him packing. But last night, at the inn, I saw him in the hall, talking to someone on the telephone. He didn't see me, but he sounded angry. Said something about not waiting forever and the money's coming. I couldn't hear the rest, but it made my skin crawl. Miss Marple's lips pursed, though her smile remained gentle. How very curious. One wonders who he was speaking to and what money he means, with the insurance still in process. You've been most observant, my dear. Joyce flushed, clutching her sketchbook. I just wish I could do more. That vision is still with me, like a warning eye. Can't understand. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch steadying. You're doing more than you know, Joyce. Keep sketching, keep listening. The truth, like your drawings, takes shape one line at a time. As Joyce returned to her sketching, Miss Marple made her way back to the village, her mind turning to Dr. Haydock. His comment about the autopsy's haste had lingered, and she wondered if a second look might reveal more. She found him at his surgery, a small building near the church, his desk cluttered with papers and a stethoscope. Miss Marple, he said, rising with a smile. Come to check on my health, or is it something else? Miss Marple chuckled, settling into a chair. Oh, my health's quite enough bother, Dr. Haydock. But I've been thinking about poor Mrs. Denham. Your testimony at the inquest was so clear. Yet I wondered, might there be anything you didn't mention? In St. Mary Mead, we had a case where a drowning wasn't quite what it seemed. Dr. Haydock's smile faded, his fingers drumming on the desk. You're a sharp one, Miss Marple. I'll be honest, the autopsy was rushed, with the coroner pressing for a quick verdict. No water in the lungs, as I said, which points to death before submersion. But there was something else, a faint mark on her neck, like a bruise, but so slight I didn't think it significant. Could have been from the rocks, or even a necklace. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained placid. A bruise, you say? How extraordinary, and no sign of a struggle elsewhere. None, Dr. Haydock said, shaking his head. No scratches, no broken nails. If she was attacked, it was quick, and she didn't fight back. But I'm no detective, Miss Marple. I reported what I saw. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind seizing on the bruise. A mark on the neck could mean strangulation, or a blow to subdue her, done with care to avoid obvious signs. She recalled a case where a woman had been drugged before being drowned, the lack of struggle masking the crime. Could Geoffrey have used something similar, perhaps a sedative from the cottage, to ensure Carol's compliance? Her final stop was the inn, where she sought out Mr. Trewin, the innkeeper, who had served Geoffrey on the night of Carol's death. She found him in the bar, polishing glasses with a rag. Mr. Trewin, she said, her voice warm, you've been so kind to us guests. I was wondering about that night poor Mrs. Denham died. Mr. Denham was here, I believe, having a drink. One does try to piece these things together. Mr. Trewin nodded, his face guarded. He was here, Miss Marple. Came in round 8, had a whiskey or two, talked with some locals, then left round 10, maybe a bit later. Seemed normal enough, though quieter than usual. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen. And was he here the whole time, or did he step out at all? Mr. Trewin hesitated, his rag pausing. Can't say for certain. Bar was busy, you know. He might have slipped out for a bit, nobody was watching him close. But he was back by 10, sure enough. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind cataloguing the gap. 2 hours, with a possible absence, gave Geoffrey time to act if he had planned. It, the tide, the bruise, the skiff, the muddy coat, these were stitches in a pattern that tightened around him. But the pattern was not complete, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, knew she must find the final threads. Back in her room, she sat by the window, the sea a silver line beyond. Joyce's vision, the insurance, The cliff's silent testimony, these were clues to a crime as calculated as any she had encountered. Pereth, like St. Mary Mead, hid its sins beneath a placid surface, but Miss Marple, with her patient unravelling, was determined to expose them. Chapter 7. The Husband's Masks. The seventh day in Pereth dawned with a soft, golden light that bathed the village in a deceptive serenity, as if the sea and sky had conspired to erase the stain of Carol Denham's death. The Pereth Arms, though, carried a lingering unease, its breakfast room quieter than usual, the clink of teacups muted by the village's unspoken questions. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her corner table, spread marmalade on her toast with the precision of a watchmaker, her sharp eyes flitting over the other guests. Her black lace mittens lay neatly beside her, and her knitting remained in its wicker basket, for her mind was wholly occupied with the threads of evidence she had gathered. The tide chart, confirming a low tide on the night of Carol's death, had solidified Miss Marple's theory that the cliff's base was accessible, a stage for a staged accident. Dr. Haydock's mention of a faint bruise on Carol's neck, coupled with the absence of water in her lungs, suggested a death far from accidental, perhaps, a quick, calculated act before the sea was enlisted to obscure it. Tom Pengley's sighting of Geoffrey Denham, agitated and near the cliffs, with his skiff moored out of place, added a chilling detail, as did Mrs. Trelawney's memory of his muddy coat. Joyce Lempriere's overheard telephone call hinting at money soon to come, and Lily's report of Geoffrey packing papers at the cottage, painted a picture of a man poised to flee. The insurance policy, a £20,000 motive, was the cornerstone of Miss Marple's suspicions. But she needed more a glimpse behind Geoffrey's polished facade to confirm his guilt. The breakfast room held its familiar faces. Joyce, sketching at a window table, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. Mrs. Babcock, fussing with her pearls and whispering to Mr. Trewin, who nodded absently, and a scattering of tourists, their voices low as they discussed the funeral planned for tomorrow. Major Palgrave had returned, his red face flushed from a morning walk, though his usual bluster was subdued. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, caught a snippet of gossip from Lily, the maid, who was refilling a teapot nearby. "Mr. Denham's been at the inn all morning," Lily murmured to Mrs. Babcock. "In his room, writing letters, he says. Looks like he's planning something, if you ask me." Mrs. Babcock's eyes widened, her scone crumbling. "Letters? Good heavens, Lily, to whom? He's not leaving already, is he?" Lily shrugged, balancing the teapot. "Dunno, ma'am, but he's been asking about trains to London. Said he's got business to settle after the funeral." Miss Marple's teaspoon paused, though her expression remained placid. Geoffrey's preparations to leave, so soon after Carol's death, were a thread that tugged at her suspicions. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a man's hasty departure had betrayed his guilt, his letters revealing a plan to sell stolen goods. Geoffrey's letters, she thought, might hold a clue perhaps to the insurance claim, or to the mysterious recipient of his urgent telephone call. She resolved to speak with him directly, for Miss Marple knew that a man's mask often slipped under the gentle pressure of a seemingly harmless conversation. Rising from her table, she gathered her shawl and umbrella, her brogues tapping softly as she made her way to the lounge. There she found Joyce, who looked up with a tentative smile. "Miss Marple, are you off to the cliffs again? I was thinking of sketching the cottage today, it's so lonely out there." Miss Marple paused, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "A fine idea, but do take care near the cliffs. I have a little errand at the inn today, but I may join you later." Your sketches, you know, are like a map of this mystery. Joyce blushed, her fingers tightening on her pencil. You really think so? I keep wondering if I'll see that blood again, but I'm almost afraid to try. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch light but reassuring. Don't force it, Joyce. The truth comes when it's ready, like a flower opening. For now, keep your eyes open, and we'll see what the day brings. Leaving Joyce to her sketching, Miss Marple approached Mr. Trewin at the bar, her voice warm but purposeful. Mr. Trewin, I wonder if I might trouble you for a small favour. I'd like to send my condolences to Mr. Denham's Arch. A sad time for him. Is he in his room, do you know? Mr. Trewin, polishing a glass, nodded. Aye, Miss Marple, he's upstairs, room 12. Been there all morning, like Lily said. Shall I send him a message? Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle. Oh, no need for that. I'll just pop up with a note, if it's no bother. One does feel for the poor man, all alone. Mr. Trewin hesitated, then shrugged. No bother at all. Stairs are to the right. Mind the creaky step. Miss Marple thanked him and climbed the narrow staircase, her umbrella a steady rhythm against the wood. Room 12 was at the end of the corridor, its door slightly ajar, a murmur of voices drifting out. She paused, her sharp ears catching Geoffrey's low, urgent tone. I'll have it soon, I swear, just a few more days. Don't push me, or we'll both regret it. A pause, then a sharper edge. You know what's at stake. Miss Marple. Heart quickened, though her face remained serene. The conversation, clearly one-sided, suggested a telephone call, echoing Joyce's eavesdropping. She knocked softly, her knuckles light against the door. The voice stopped abruptly, and after a moment, Geoffrey appeared, his dark hair slightly dishevelled, his smile quick but strained. Miss Marple, isn't it? What a surprise. Do come in. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes taking in the room, a suitcase open on the bed, papers scattered across a desk, a half-empty whiskey glass beside a telephone. I hope I'm not intruding, Mr. Denham, she said, her voice soft but clear. I only wanted to offer my sympathies. Such a dreadful loss, and you've been so brave. Geoffrey's smile tightened, though his charm held. Very kind of you, Miss Marple. It's been difficult, as you can imagine. Carol loved Pereth, and his voice broke, and he turned away, his hand brushing his eyes. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her umbrella resting against her knee. Of course, one can see how deeply you cared for her. I heard you were at the inn that night, with Mr. Trewin and the others. It must be a comfort, having such a clear memory of the evening. Geoffrey nodded, his fingers tightening on the desk. Yes, I was here until late. Carol often walked alone. She loved the cliffs at dusk. I should have gone with her, but he trailed off, his eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze steady. Indeed, and yet someone mentioned seeing you near the cliffs earlier, perhaps around 9. The village does notice these things, doesn't it? Geoffrey's head snapped up, a flicker of unease crossing his face. The cliffs? No, I was here, at the inn. People must be mistaken. Grief makes them see things that aren't there. His laugh was forced, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the whiskey glass. Miss Marple's eyes followed the movement, noting the tremor. Of course, she said, her tone soothing. Memories can be so unreliable. In St. Mary Mead, we had a case where a man swore he was at a pub, but a barmaid's recollection proved otherwise. It's the little details, you see, that matter. Geoffrey's smile faltered, his fingers tightening on the glass. Details. I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple. I've told the constable everything. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but probing. Oh, just small things like the insurance policy, such a generous sum. Or the boat, moored so oddly that night. One does hear talk, and it's so hard to know what's true. Geoffrey's face paled, his hand jerking, spilling a drop of whiskey. Insurance, that's private business, Miss Marple. As for the boat, I often move it, nothing unusual there. I'm afraid I'm rather busy, if you'll excuse me. Miss Marple rose, her smile undimmed. Of course, Mr. Denham, I've taken enough of your time. Do take care, and my sympathies, again. She stepped into the corridor, her heart racing but her steps slow, as if she had merely paid a courtesy call. Downstairs, she found Joyce in the lounge, her sketchbook open to a new drawing of the cottage, its dark windows stark against the cliffs. Miss Marple, Joyce said, her voice low, I saw something at the cottage today. The grocer's boy, Jimmy, was delivering, and he mentioned seeing Mr. Denham with a rope near the cliffs a few days before Mrs. Denham died. He thought it was for fishing, but it seemed strange to me. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained gentle. A rope, you say? How very interesting. In St. Mary Mead, a rope once told a story no one expected. Thank you, Joyce, you've a knack for finding the right details. Joyce flushed, clutching her sketchbook. I just want to help. That vision, it's still with me, like a shadow I can't shake. Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch steadying. You're helping more than you know, my dear. Keep watching, and we'll see where this leads. Her next stop was the village square, where she sought out Jimmy, the grocer's boy, who was unloading crates outside Mr. Poldark's shop. Good morning, Jimmy, she said, her voice warm. I hear you've been busy with deliveries. Joyce mentioned you saw Mr. Denham with a rope near the cliffs. Such an observant lad you are. Jimmy blushed, setting down a crate. I, Miss Marple, was a few days before Mrs. Denham died. He was carrying a coil of rope, like for climbing or hauling. Said it was for his boat, but it looked heavy, not the usual kind for fishing. Miss Marple nodded, slipping him a shilling. You've a good memory, Jimmy. Keep it sharp, won't you? As she walked back to the inn, her mind wove the new detail into the pattern. A rope, a bruise, a low tide, a muddy coat. Geoffrey's mask, she sensed, was slipping, his unease under her questions a sign of a man cornered by his own lies. She recalled a case where a husband's nervous hands had betrayed him, his alibi crumbling under the weight of small truths. Geoffrey's whiskey glass, his trembling fingers, his hasty dismissal, these were cracks in his facade, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, intended to widen them. Back at the Pereth Arms, she sat by her window, the sea a golden ribbon. Under the afternoon sun, the rope, she thought, could have been used to lower Carol's body, or to bind her before death, ensuring no struggle. The bruise on her neck, the absence of water in her lungs, these suggested a method both brutal and precise, hidden by the sea's complicity. Geoffrey's letters, his plans to leave, his urgent calls all pointed to a man racing against time, perhaps fearing discovery as evening approached. Miss Marple resolved to watch him closely, for the funeral tomorrow would bring him into the open, where his mask might slip further. Pereth, like St. Mary Mead, was a place where secrets surfaced slowly, but Miss Marple, with her patient unravelling, was determined to bring them to light. Chapter 8. The The pavement's truth. The 8th day in Pereth unfolded under a sky bruised with clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain that seemed to mirror the village's somber mood. The funeral of Carol Denham was set for noon, and the Pereth Arms, usually a hub of morning chatter, was subdued, its breakfast room filled with hushed voices and the rustle of black attire. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her corner table, sipped her tea with measured calm, her sharp eyes observing the guests through the steam rising from her cup. Her black lace mittens lay folded beside her, and her knitting remained in its wicker basket, for her thoughts were consumed by the intricate web of clues she had woven over the past. Weak. Geoffrey Denham's trembling hands during their encounter, coupled with his evasive answers about the cliffs and the insurance policy, had confirmed Miss Marple's belief that his grief was a performance meticulously staged to deflect suspicion. The rope seen by Jimmy, the grocer's boy, suggested a tool for murder or concealment, while the faint bruise on Carol's neck, noted by Dr. Haydock, pointed to a death before the sea's embrace, the low tide, the misplaced skiff, the muddy coat, and Geoffrey's urgent plans to leave all formed a pattern that Miss Marple recognized from cases in St. Mary Mead, where greed and desperation had driven men to unthinkable acts. Joyce Lempriere's vision of blood on the quay, though still a mystery, seemed to her a spark of intuition, a fleeting glimpse of Geoffrey's guilt that the artist's mind had translated into a vivid image. The breakfast room was sparsely populated, many guests preparing for the funeral at St. Perrin's Church. Joyce sat alone, her sketchbook closed, her auburn hair pinned neatly for the occasion. Mrs. Babcock, dressed in sombre black, was whispering to Mr. Trewin about the propriety of Geoffrey's haste to depart. Major Palgrave, his red face solemn, was absent, perhaps already at the church. Miss Marple, finishing her toast, caught a snippet of conversation from Lily, the maid, who was clearing plates nearby. "Mr. Denham's been up since dawn," Lily murmured to Mrs. Babcock. "Saw him at the cottage again, fetching things. Looked like he was in a state, dropping papers and all." Mrs. Babcock's pearls clicked as she leaned forward. "Papers? Good heavens, Lily, what sort? He's not selling the cottage already, is he?" Lily shrugged, stacking plates. "Dunno, ma'am, but," he was muttering to himself, "something about getting it done gave me the shivers, it did." Miss Marple's teaspoon paused, though her expression remained serene. Geoffrey's agitation, so close to the funeral, was a thread that tugged at her suspicions. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a murderer's nervous preparations had betrayed him on the eve of a memorial service. Papers, Lily had said, perhaps related to the insurance claim, or something more damning, like a letter revealing his plans. Miss Marple resolved to attend the funeral, not only to pay her respects, but to watch Geoffrey closely, for grief, she knew, could crack even the most polished mask. Rising from her table, she gathered her shawl and umbrella, her tapping softly as she made her way to the lounge. There she found Joyce, who looked up with a strained smile. "Miss Marple, are you going to the funeral?" "I feel I should, but I'm so nervous after everything we've learned." Miss Marple paused, her eyes kind behind her spectacles. My dear, and you're welcome to join me. It's a sad duty, but one we must fulfill. Your presence, you know, has been most valuable in this affair. Your vision is like a beacon, guiding us to the truth." Joyce's fingers tightened on her sketchbook, though she left it closed. "I hope so. I keep thinking about that pavement, the blood. It's as if it was warning me, but I still don't understand how." Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch light but steadying. "We're close, Joyce. The truth is like a tide, it rises slowly, but it always comes. For now, let's honor Mrs. Denham and keep our eyes open." Leaving the inn, Miss Marple and Joyce walked to St. Piran's, a stone church perched on a hill overlooking the sea. The village had turned out in force, their black umbrellas dotting the path like mourners' shadows. Inside, the air was cool, scented with wax and old hymnals, the pews filled with locals and visitors alike. Geoffrey stood near the altar, his dark suit impeccable, his face a study in sorrow. Yet Miss Marple, seated near the back with Joyce, noted the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting an interruption or an escape. The service was brief, the vicar's words earnest but uninspired, dwelling on the fragility of life and the sea's unpredictability. Geoffrey delivered a short eulogy, his voice steady but hollow, praising Carol's love of Pereth and her quiet strength. Miss Marple, listening, thought his words sounded rehearsed, like lines from a play he had memorized but not felt. She recalled a case where a husband's eulogy had been his undoing, its perfection betraying a lack of genuine grief. Geoffrey's hands, she noted, gripped the lectern too tightly, his knuckles white dot as the congregation filed out to the churchyard, where Carol's coffin was lowered into the earth. Miss Marple lingered, her umbrella a shield against the gathering drizzle. Joyce, beside her, whispered, "He didn't cry, Miss Marple, not once. Doesn't that seem odd?" Miss Marple's lips pursed, though her smile remained gentle. "Very observant, my dear. Grief shows itself in many ways, but its absence is telling. Let's watch a little longer." After the burial, the mourners gathered at the Pereth Arms. For a modest reception, the lounge filled with murmured condolences and the clink of sherry glasses. Geoffrey moved among the guests, accepting sympathies with a practiced nod, his charm intact but strained. Miss Marple, sipping her sherry, positioned herself near the fireplace, where she could observe without drawing attention. She noted Geoffrey's frequent glances at his watch, his brief exchanges with Mr. Trewin about train schedules, and his avoidance of Constable Tregarth, who stood awkwardly by the door. Her opportunity came when Geoffrey stepped onto the porch. For a cigarette, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky, Miss Marple followed, her shawl drawn tight against the damp, her umbrella tapping the floorboards. "Mr. Denham," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I hope I'm not intruding. Such a moving service, and you spoke so eloquently. Mrs. Denham would have been touched." Geoffrey turned, his cigarette glowing in the gloom, his smile quick but brittle. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's been a trying day. I'm just catching my breath." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes keen behind her spectacles. "Of course, one does need a moment's peace. I heard you've been busy, preparing to leave Pereth. It must be difficult, with so much to settle the cottage, the insurance, all those papers." Geoffrey's hand froze, the cigarette halfway to his lips, a flicker of panic crossing his face. "Papers? I'm not sure what you mean. Just tying up loose ends. You know Carol's affairs." Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone gentle, but probing, naturally. "Though I did hear about the insurancer. Generous sum, they say. And that rope, seen near the cliffs before the tragedy. It's curious how things add up, isn't it? In St. Mary Mead, we had a case where a rope and a few papers told a story no one expected." Geoffrey's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing. "You're quite the detective, Miss Marple, but I've nothing to hide. The rope was for my boat, the insurance was Carol's idea, and the papers are just personal, I'd rather not discuss it. Miss Marple's smile remained, though her gaze was steely. Of course, Mr. Denham, I'm just an old woman, prone to chatter. But the village does talk about the cliffs, the tide, that bruise on your wife's neck. One wonders what the sea might have seen. Geoffrey's cigarette dropped, sparking on the porch, his face paling in the dim light. Bruise? What are you talking about? The coroner said it was an accident. Everyone knows that. Miss Marple leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone, perhaps, but not everything. Joyce's vision, you see the blood on the pavement, came just after you passed the quay. It's almost as if she saw your guilt, Mr. Denham, written in the stones. Geoffrey's breath caught, his hands clenching, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might bolt. But he laughed, a harsh, unsteady sound, and crushed the cigarette under his heel. You're fanciful, Miss Marple. Visions, blood. It's nonsense, and you know it. I loved Caroline, never hurt her. Miss Marple stepped back, her umbrella tapping the floor. I hope so, Mr. Denham. But the truth, like the tide, has a way of coming in. Good evening. She returned to the lounge, her heart racing but her steps measured, as if she had merely exchanged pleasantries. Joyce, waiting by the fireplace, hurried over, her eyes wide. Miss Marple, what happened? You were talking to him, I saw his face. He looked terrified. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her voice low. I planted a seed, my dear, and it took root. He's frightened, and frightened men make mistakes. We're close now, Joyce, very close. The reception ended, and the guests dispersed, but Miss Marple lingered, her mind racing. She envisioned the night of Carol's death, Geoffrey, driven by debt and desperation, luring his wife to the cottage. A sedative, perhaps, to quiet her, a bruise from a quick grip to the neck, or a cloth pressed too long. Then, under cover of darkness, a body carried to the cliffs at low tide, the rope used to lower it to the rocks. The skiff moved to obscure his tracks. The sea, rising with the tide, had done the rest, washing away evidence but not the truth. Her thoughts were interrupted by Constable Tregarth, who approached with a hesitant nod. Miss Marple, a word, if you please. I've been hearing things about Denham, the insurance, that rope. You've been asking questions, haven't you? Miss Marple smiled, her tone mild, only listening, Constable, as old women do. But I think Mr. Denham has more to tell. The bruise on Mrs. Denham's neck, the low tide, his skiff out of place, these are worth another look, don't you think? Tregarth's brow furrowed, but he nodded. Aye, maybe so. I'll have a word with him, see what shakes loose. You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind already turning to the quay. That evening, as the village settled into a rainy dusk, she walked there alone, her umbrella shielding her from the drizzle. The pavement, slick with rain, gleamed under the harbour lights, its stones silent but heavy with meaning. She stood where Joyce had sat, envisioning Geoffrey passing by, his mind already set on murder. The blood Joyce saw, Miss Marple concluded, was no vision but a spark of truth, moment when the artist's intuition had caught the shadow of his intent. Back at the inn, she found Joyce in the lounge, her sketchbook open to a new drawing of the quay, the stones rendered in stark, wet lines. Miss Marple, Joyce said, her voice low, I went back today to the quay. I didn't see the blood again, but I felt something, like the place was watching me. Miss Marple settled beside her, her eyes kind but keen. You felt the truth, my dear. The pavement has spoken through you. Mr. Denham's mask is slipping, and soon we'll see his face." As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, to see a dark murmur beyond. The funeral had been a turning point, Geoffrey's fear a crack in his facade. The pavement's truth, she knew, was not in its stones, but in the guilt it had witnessed. Pereth, like St. Mary Mead, held its secrets close, but Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was ready to lay them bare. Chapter 9. The Confession. The 9th day in Pereth broke with a tentative dawn, the clouds of the previous evening parting to reveal a sky streaked with pink and gold, as if the village sought to cleanse itself of the shadow cast by Carol Denham's death. The Pereth Arms, though, remained a place of quiet tension, its breakfast room subdued despite the morning's promise. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her corner table, stirred her tea with a silver spoon, her sharp eyes scanning the guests with the calm vigilance of a lighthouse keeper. Her black lace mittens lay neatly beside her, and her knitting stayed in its wicker basket, for her thoughts were wholly consumed by the confrontation at the funeral and the cracks she had opened in Geoffrey Denham's carefully crafted facade. The previous evening's encounter on the inn's porch had been a turning point. Geoffrey's panic at the mention of the bruise on Carol's neck, the rope, and Joyce Lempriere's vision had betrayed a man teetering on the edge of exposure. The rope seen by Jimmy, the low tide confirmed by Iago, the misplaced skiff noted by Tom Pengelly, and the muddy coat recalled by Mrs. Trelawney formed a mosaic of evidence that pointed to a calculated murder. The insurance policy, a £20,000 motive, and Geoffrey's urgent plans to flee, as reported by Lily, tightened the net. Joyce's vision of blood on the quay, Miss Marple now believed, was no mere fancy but a spark of intuition, catching the guilt that had passed with Geoffrey that fateful afternoon. In St. Mary Mead she had seen such sparks ignite the truth, and Pereth, she sensed, was no different. The breakfast room was sparsely attended, the funeral's weight lingering like a fog. Joyce sat by the window, her sketchbook closed, her auburn hair pinned loosely, her face pale but resolute. Mrs. Babcock, her pearls subdued by a black blouse, was whispering to Mr. Trewin about Geoffrey's absence from the inn that morning. Major Palgrave, his bluster muted, was reading a newspaper, his coffee untouched. Miss Marple, nibbling her toast, caught a snippet of gossip from Lily, who was clearing plates nearby. "Mr. Denham's gone to the cottage again," Lily murmured to Mrs. Babcock. "Saw him leave at first light, carrying a bag. Looked like he was running from something." Mrs. Babcock's eyes widened, her teaspoon clinking against her saucer. "Running? Good heavens, Lily, what's he up to now? Surely he's not leaving before the insurance is settled." Lily shrugged, balancing a stack of plates. "Dunno, ma'am, but he was in a state, muttering about no time left. Gave me the creeps, it did." Miss Marple's teaspoon paused, though her expression remained placid. Geoffrey's early departure, so soon after her probing questions, was a sign of a man unravelling. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a murderer had fled under cover of dawn, only to be caught by a milkman's sharp eyes. Geoffrey's bag, she thought, might contain the papers Lily had seen, perhaps evidence he meant to destroy, or a plan to collect the insurance and vanish. Miss Marple resolved to act swiftly, for a cornered man, she knew, was both dangerous and prone to mistakes. Rising from her table, she gathered her shawl and umbrella, her brogues tapping softly. As she made her way to the lounge, there she found Joyce, who looked up with a determined nod. "Miss Marple, I heard about Mr. Denham leaving. Do you think he's trying to get away? After what you said last night, I can't stop thinking about it." Miss Marple paused, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "You're quite right to wonder, my dear. He's frightened, and frightened men act rashly. I'm going to the cottage to have a word with him, but first I need to speak with Constable Tregarth. Would you care to come along? Your presence has been invaluable, you know." Joyce's eyes widened, but she nodded, clutching her sketchbook. "I'll come. I want to help, Miss Marple. That vision, it's like it's pushing me to see this through." Miss Marple patted her arm, her touch light but steadying. "You've been a beacon, Joyce, and we're nearly at the truth. Let's go, and keep your wits about you." Leaving the inn, Miss Marple and Joyce walked to the constable's office, a squat building near the village square where the air smelled of salt and damp stone. Constable Tregarth was outside, polishing his bicycle, his broad face creased with worry. "Miss Marple," he said, straightening, "and Miss Lempriere, I was just thinking of you. Been hearing more about Denham Doe's papers, his talk of leaving. You've stirred something up, haven't you?" Miss Marple smiled, her tone mild but firm. "Only the truth, Constable, which has a way of stirring itself. I spoke with Mr. Denham last night, and he was most unsettled about the bruise on his wife's neck, the rope, the tide. I believe he's at the cottage now, perhaps preparing to flee. It might be wise to have a word with him, don't you think?" Tregarth's brow furrowed, but he nodded, grabbing his helmet. "Aye, you're right. That bruise, Dr. Haydock mentioned it to me this morning, said he wished he'd looked closer. And the rope, the boat, it's adding up. I'll come with you, but we'll need to be careful. He's a slippery one." The trio set off for the cottage, their steps quick against the cobbles. The village was waking, fishermen hauling nets and shopkeepers opening shutters. But the cottage, perched at the cliff's edge, stood apart, its stone walls sombre under the morning light. As they approached, Miss Marple noted the door ajar, a faint clatter echoing from within. She signalled Tregarth to lead, her umbrella a steady rhythm as she followed with Joyce. Inside, the cottage was dim, its air thick with dust and the scent of neglect. Geoffrey was in the parlour, crouched over a suitcase, stuffing papers into a leather satchel. He froze at their entrance, his face piling his hands, trembling as he stood. "Constable, Miss Marple, what's this about? I'm just sorting Carol's things." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but steely. "Good morning, Mr. Denham. We won't take much of your time. But there are questions, you see, about the night your wife died. The low tide, the skiff out of place, the rope Jimmy saw you with, and that bruise, so faint but so telling. One does wonder what really happened." Geoffrey's eyes darted to the door, but Tregarth blocked it, his stance firm. "Stay put, Mr. Denham. Miss Marple's got a point. We've been hearing things about the insurance, your debts, your plans to leave. Best you explain yourself." Geoffrey laughed, a brittle sound that echoed in the small room. "Explain? It's all nonsense village gossip. Carol fell. The coroner said so. You've no proof of anything else." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "Proof, Mr. Denham, is in the details. The tide was low, allowing you to carry her to the rocks. The skiff moved to cover your tracks. The rope to lower her body. The bruise, from a moment of violence, saw perhaps a sedative, to ensure no struggle. And Joyce's vision, catching your guilt as you passed the quay. It's a pattern, you see, and patterns don't lie. Joyce, standing behind, gasped softly, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. Geoffrey's face crumpled, his hands clenching, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might deny it further. But then his shoulders sagged, and he sank onto a chair, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't understand. I didn't want to. It was the debt creditors hounding me, threatening to ruin us. Carol didn't know how bad it was. The insurance was her idea, but I saw a way out." Tregarth's eyes narrowed, his hand on his notebook. "Go on, Denham. What did you do?" Geoffrey's gaze fixed on the floor, his words halting. "That night, we argued at the cottage. She found out I'd borrowed against the policy, lied to her about it. She was furious, said she'd leave me. I couldn't let Hyde lose everything. I gave her a sedative in her tea just to calm her, but it was too much. She collapsed, and I panicked. She wasn't breathing." Miss Marple's lips pursed, though her expression remained calm. "And then, Mr. Denham, what did you do with her?" Geoffrey's voice broke, his hands covering his face. "I carried her to the cliffs. It was low tide, easy to reach the rocks. I used the rope to lower her, made it look like she'd fallen. The skiff, I moved it to make it seem I'd been out, not at the cottage. The sea would do the rest, I thought. No one would know." Joyce's eyes widened, her voice a whisper. "The blood. I saw it when you passed the key. It was like I knew." Geoffrey's head snapped up, his eyes wild. "You saw nothing. It's impossible you're making it up." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Not impossible, Mr. Denham. Joyce's mind saw what her eyes could endure: guilt, as you walked past, planning your wife's death. The pavement didn't lie, and neither did she." Tregarth, his face grim, pulled out handcuffs. "Geoffrey Denham, you're under arrest for the murder of Carol Denham. Come quietly, now." Geoffrey offered no resistance, his head bowed as Tregarth led him out. Miss Marple and Joyce followed, the cottage's silence heavy behind them. Back in the village, the news spread like wildfire, the square buzzing with shock and whispers. Miss Marple, her umbrella tapping the cobbles, felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a confession had come just as suddenly, the truth breaking like a dam under the weight of small truths at the Pereth Arms. Joyce sat with Miss Marple in the lounge, her sketchbook open to the keys, stones, now free of imagined blood. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "how did you know? It was like you saw it all, from the start." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair. "I didn't see, my dear, I listened. To you, to Tom, to Mrs. Trelawney, to the village itself. Your vision was the spark, but the truth was in the details, the tide, the rope, the bruise. In St. Mary Mead, I learned that people are much the same wherever you go. Greed, fear, guilt, they leave traces, if you know where to look." Joyce nodded, her eyes bright. "I think I'll paint something happier next. Flowers, maybe, or the sea on a calm day. No more blood." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch warm. "A wise choice, Joyce. You've a gift, and it served Pereth well. Now, let's have some tea, and put this behind us." As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the sea a silver thread under the moon. The confession had closed. The case, but she felt the familiar pang of sorrow for a life lost and a soul undone by greed. Pereth, like St. Mary Mead, would heal, its secrets laid bare by the pavement's truth. Tomorrow she would pack her knitting and return home, her work here done, but for now she watched the tide, its rhythm a reminder that truth, like the sea, always finds its way.